Napoleon's Russian Gamble, Anatomy of an Empire's Collapse, The Sole Master of Europe, and the Rise of Hubris. The spring months of 1812 were not merely a time of changing seasons. They marked a period where the greatest display of power in human history reached its peak before ending in utter frustration. Europe was ruled by sentences falling from the lips of a single individual, Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not just an emperor, he was the man who displaced every known and respected monarch of Europe, redrew centuries-old borders with a single stroke of his pen, and was believed to dictate destiny itself. To some, he was a modern Caesar. To others, an arrogant, determined, and ruthless monster who reshaped the existing order to his whim. Yet, there was one truth upon which everyone agreed. He was like a living god-king. Across that immense geography stretching from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the endless plains of Poland, the famous French standards fluttered in the wind. Napoleon had embroidered the continent like lace, leaving his mark on every street and every square. But history has an immutable rule. Every peak ends in an abyss. When you reach the highest point of power, the only place left to look is down. Napoleon had conquered Europe in the physical world, but the true enemy in his mind lay in the shadows of the East, in the giant of the North, Russia. The Dresden Display, the man at the center of the world. In May 1812, the city of Dresden bore witness to a spectacle the world had never seen before. The city's streets played host to nobles, generals, and kings from every corner of Europe. The Emperor of Austria, the King of Prussia, the rulers of Saxony, and dozens of princes. Yet, this was not a summit of friendship or a routine meeting between states. This was a ceremony of allegiance to Napoleon, a ritual of acknowledging his absolute authority once again. Visualize it. As the massive doors of the palace swing open, the most powerful man in the world at that time enters, and the ancient dynasties of Europe bow before him as if they were mere servants. Napoleon treated these monarchs not as diplomats, but as subordinates in his own army. To put it in his own words, "My authority comes not from wearing that crown, but from earning it anew every single day." Historians recounting those days speak this vital sentence. No mortal had ever possessed such vast power in such a short time and in such an absolute manner. However, behind this ostentatious tableau lay a much darker reality. Those lavish banquets in Dresden were the quietest moments of a looming bloody annihilation, the greatest tragedy of the century. Napoleon viewed Tsar Alexander's defiance, his breach of the continental system, not merely as a political error, but as a personal insult. He was unaccustomed to being disobeyed. Punishing Russia was not just a strategy, it was an obligation. The continental system, the bloody face of trade. In Napoleon's mind, the primary cause for the war's commencement was neither border disputes nor ideological differences. At the heart of everything lay money. Napoleon's greatest desire was for his arch-rival, England, to submit to him. When he realized he could not defeat the mighty British Navy at sea, he decided to bring them under economic pressure. This destructive embargo project, named the Continental System, aimed to close all of Europe's gates to British merchant ships forever. Napoleon intended to starve England on its own soil, halt their production, and force them to surrender. Yet this plan had a massive flaw that he failed to anticipate, a flaw that would prevent him from reaching his goals. Russia, which possessed an incredible trade volume with England, was suffering immense hardships due to this blockade. Russian agricultural products were rotting in warehouses. As the economy drifted toward a quagmire, the people grew increasingly impoverished, and the aristocracy lost access to British luxury goods. Tsar Alexander was thinking of the future of his people and his nobles, as well as his own power. In late 1810, the Tsar took a courageous step and secretly opened Russian ports to British goods via neutral ships. When this news reached France, Napoleon was infuriated. In his eyes, this was not just a trade agreement, it was a grand betrayal. In the harsh letters he wrote to Alexander, he clearly stated that this move was a casus belli, a reason for war. As the tone of the mutual diplomatic correspondence sharpened, the armies continued to prepare with increasing speed. Dialogues had ended, replaced by the cold sound of steel and the terrifying scent of gunpowder. The drums of war were now audible across all of Europe. The Grande Armée, a modern Tower of Babel. When June 1812 arrived, an army of a magnitude human history had never seen gathered on the Vistula plains of Poland, the Grande Armée, the Great Army. This army did not consist only of Frenchmen. Soldiers from every land where Napoleon held sway were present. The French formed the main body, but beside them were Poles burning with the fire of revenge against the Russians, Germans forced into service, Dutchmen with the highest level of military discipline, Italians, Swiss, and even Spaniards and Portuguese. This army, where 20 different languages were spoken, was quite literally a modern Tower of Babel. A single common thought occupied the minds of most soldiers: If Napoleon is with us, victory is ours. Napoleon controlled this magnificent 600,000-man force, the greatest destructive power in history. With his cannons, his cavalry, and his world-renowned Old Guard, he had no doubt that they were an invincible force. They were going to Russia not just to invade a country, but to establish their own order in the world. However, the logistical needs of this massive army were more difficult than fighting the enemy in the vast, roadless geography of Russia. None of them realized that those steppes would swallow them like a swamp. Their eyes were too blinded by hubris to see these realities, getting lost in eternity. The Niemen River, the threshold of no return. The night of June 24th, 1812, was the moment the course of history changed. By the banks of the Niemen River, over 400,000 soldiers gathered silently under the moonlight. Napoleon sat upon his white horse at the riverbank. The opposite side, the Russian soil, was dark and unexpectedly silent. Not a single border unit, not a single cannon shot, only a deep silence. As the lead soldiers crossed the bridges built over the river, they were passing not just a border, but the gates of the hell that awaited them. According to legend, while Napoleon was in the middle of the river, a rabbit startled his horse, causing him to fall. The officers who witnessed this whispered among themselves, "This is a Roman omen. This time it bodes no good at all." But Napoleon believed not in fate or omens, but only in his own power. This advance, beginning that night, was not just for a piece of land, but to seize the heart and soul of Russia. Scorched earth, the invisible enemy. As Napoleon advanced toward the interior of Russia, he noticed something strange. There was no army to fight. The Russians were retreating. But this was not cowardice. It was one of the most ruthless war strategies in history. Scorched earth. General Barclay de Tolly and later Kutuzov, as they withdrew, left not a single grain of wheat, not a single sturdy hut, nor a single water source behind. They were setting fire to their own villages, their own homes. As the French army advanced, the scorching summer heat turned the steppes into an oven. Swallowing clouds of dust surrounded the soldiers. Horses, unable to find water, died, one after another, along the roadsides. Before a single bullet was even fired, the Grande Armée had begun to lose tens of thousands of soldiers to dysentery, hunger, and thirst. Nature had become more lethal than bullets. Smolensk, the holy city and the flames. By August, Napoleon finally saw the Russians gathering at Smolensk. "There," he said, "I have finally caught them." Napoleon's cannons bombarded the city for days, leveling the walls. Entering the city with the intoxication of victory, the emperor was horrified by what he saw. Instead of surrendering their holy city, the Russians had set it ablaze. Smolensk was in flames. Thousands of corpses lying in the streets, churches collapsing amidst the fire, and a history turned to ash, an entire city. This was not a victory, it was a devastation. His commanders pleaded with Napoleon, "Sire, let us go no further. Let us spend the winter here and rebuild the army." But for Napoleon there was now only one goal, Moscow. "If we take Moscow, we shall tear out the heart of Russia," he said. Yet the heart of Russia was beating somewhere secret, with the fire of revenge, the death struggle of giants, and the sirens of Moscow. Borodino. Rehearsal for the Apocalypse. The morning of September 7th, 1812, just a short distance from the gates of Moscow, on the plains near the village of Borodino, the world was preparing for a carnage it had never witnessed before. The first cannon shot heard as day broke signaled the start of one of the bloodiest days in history. Napoleon, as usual, sat upon his white horse, scanning the Russian positions with his sharp gaze. But this time he faced not a cowardly army, but a nation fighting to the death. General Kutuzov summarized the Russian spirit in these words: "We shall not retreat. If necessary, we shall perish on this soil." As the French and Russian cannons erupted simultaneously from their nests, the sky was covered in thick black gunpowder smoke. The noise was so deafening that blood seeped from the soldiers' ears. For Napoleon, the battle was not going as planned. He could not find the space for maneuver. The Russians stood as firm as fortresses. When the French cavalry attacked the massive Russian redoubts known as the Great Redoubt, the scene turned into hell. By evening, the Borodino plain resembled a slaughterhouse. In a single day, 80,000 people had died or been wounded there. The ground was covered in blood. The streams had begun to flow red. Napoleon had won. The road to Moscow was open. But the price of this victory had forever broken the backbone and the soul of the Grande Armée. For Napoleon, the word victory had no meaning for the first time. Moscow, a ghost city and the crimson night. On September 14th, when Napoleon reached the heights of Moscow, he looked down at the magnificent golden-domed city with admiration. "There," he said, "this is where it all ends." But something was strange. Moscow was silent, the streets deserted, the shops locked, the houses dark and abandoned. He thought the Russians had fled and left the city. And that night the sound of the wind was replaced by the crackling of flames. Moscow suddenly began to burn from all sides. On the orders of the Russian governor Rostopchin, the city had been set on fire by its own people. The flames were so gargantuan that Napoleon's face was illuminated as he watched the fire from the windows of the Kremlin. The city burned continuously for 3 days and 3 nights. As the heart of Holy Russia was surrendered to the flames and destroyed, Napoleon made that famous and fear-filled confession to the commanders beside him for the first time. These men are not barbarians. They are Scythians. They are mad enough to burn their own homes. What kind of hatred is this? What kind of will? For 5 weeks, while watching this scorched holy city from the palace window in the Kremlin, Napoleon waited for a peace letter from Tsar Alexander. But Alexander descended into a deep silence. That profound silence was enough to drive the French army to madness. Provisions were running out. Winter was at the door, and Napoleon now had to accept the inevitable. This was not a victory. They had been lost in this war. In the clutch of the White Death, the retreat in general winter. On October 19th, with a belated decision, Napoleon ordered his army to retreat. As the Grande Armée left Moscow with the spoils of war they had looted, they still looked like an army. However, this image would fall apart in just a few days. The Russians followed them, stalling them with hit-and-run tactics, because General Winter was about to arrive. With the arrival of November, the sky turned gray and the first snowflakes fell. This scene, which looked beautiful at first, would soon be the beginning of the end for the French. The temperature plummeted to 30 to 40 degrees below zero. The starving French soldiers, now struggling with their summer uniforms and shredded boots, could not cope with this relentless cold. Soldiers walking on the road would put on the clothes of their frozen friends or search their pockets for a piece of bread. Now, under the influence of the cold, those on the verge of starvation began to dismember and eat their dead comrades. As Napoleon shivered inside his famous fur, he watched his loyal guards vanish one by one into the snow. Berezina and the final curtain. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November was the peak of this disappearance. Behind was the Russian army. Ahead, a river covered in ice. French engineers entered the freezing water, building bridges even though they knew they would freeze to death. As thousands of soldiers crushed one another to reach the opposite bank, Russian cannons began to pound the crowd. The river became so filled with corpses that the flow of water stopped. The massive army that began with 600,000 men was nothing but a ruin of 30,000 to 40,000 unrecognizable people when it reached the Polish border in December. When Napoleon returned to Paris, his throne was shaking. He had been defeated not only by Russia but by his own hubris, his lack of foresight, and the absolute power of nature. Napoleon's Russian gamble had etched into history not only the collapse of an empire but also the helplessness of human will against nature. History books end this campaign as follows. Napoleon entered Russia as a great emperor, but he left it only as a memory. If you'd like to continue exploring these irreversible decisions of history together, your subscription and following would be the most valuable support for the continuation of this narrative.